Thank you very much, Manuel, for your presentation. So I'll hand over now to Bridget Newbery from the Centre for Sustainable Energy in the UK. So she'll be presenting about the policy recommendations.
Thanks, Tessa. I'm from CSE, one of the partner organisations that worked on the LEAF project. We're a UK-based charity which aims to tackle climate change and fuel poverty. I'm going to give a short overview of the LEAF policy recommendations for the retrofit of multi-occupancy buildings and the reasons we've made those recommendations. As Tessa explained, it was a 3-year project, and the amount of knowledge and understanding gained in that time has been massive. So in a quarter of an hour, I'm not going to be able to give you all of that, just the very headline stuff, but there is much more in the LEAF reports on the website. So a quick recap of the rationale behind this work. Although a large percentage of the population of Europe live in apartment blocks, it's a sector that seems to get quite overlooked. Low energy retrofit of multi-occupancy housing is much more complex than for individual domestic properties, but there are also massive opportunities to make a difference in terms of energy saving and carbon reduction, especially if the policy landscape is tweaked a bit to help make it easier. So I won't go into a lot of detail on the methodology involved in drawing up the recommendations, just to say they're the result of various packages of work within the LEAF project, extensive policy research, practical retrofit experience in the case study buildings, and engagement with a range of stakeholders. So the policy recommendations we make address the low carbon retrofit of residential buildings which are multi-occupancy and mixed tenure. We put together a core set of EU policy recommendations relevant across all the partner countries, which I'm going to focus on in this presentation, as well as recommendations specific to the EPBD, specific national policy recommendations. There are recommendations for further research off the back of this project, and examples of best practice across the different EU countries. And we also used evidence from the different strands of the project as a justification for our policy recommendations. They're not just pulled out of nowhere. So to provide some context for the recommendations at EU level, the 2010 EPBD and the 2012 EED, the Energy Efficiency Directive, are the two main pieces of EU legislation concerning energy consumption in buildings. There are various additional EU policies, including some of those listed here, but the EPBD is legislation which is most relevant to the LEAF project, covering the certification of energy performance in buildings, the inspection of heating and air conditioning systems, targets for zero energy buildings, setting minimum energy performance requirements, and financial support for energy efficiency. Now, at national level, there are also a huge number of policies to improve energy efficiency in buildings. Just within the LEAF partner countries, there are several hundred national policies, and that's not including local and regional policies, so things like local planning regulations. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just this chart is useful because you can see the split between different policy types and the number of policies in each country. Although the EPBD is the real driver behind a lot of the national policies, there are also really big differences between the different countries. So just reinforcing some of what Manuel went through just now and the challenges. When we developed the recommendations, the starting point was identifying the key challenges for retrofit and multi-occupancy buildings. The full recommendations report explains the specifics in much more detail, but broadly speaking, they can be grouped into these headings. And we use these same headings to address the policy recommendations, but it's not quite as linear as that last chart might imply. All of the different issues overlap, so the real picture looks a bit more like this, and it's quite complex. Quite a lot of the challenges actually do relate to EPCs and the way they could be improved to help facilitate retrofit projects and basic understanding of options for low carbon home improvements. So as part of the project, we've got a specific set of recommendations that are just about the EPBD and EPC recommendations. But overall, we've made 18 core recommendations which apply across all of the LEAF partner countries. We've grouped the policy recommendations by topic, but there, like I said, is quite a lot of crossover. And we do also stress the importance of taking local considerations into account for the implementation of any of these policy changes. So I'm just going to quickly run through now the core policy recommendations and provide the background for why we've made these recommendations. I'm just looking at the main issues and then what the recommendations are. So in terms of format and presentation of EPCs, as Manuel said just now, most people don't understand the information contained in the EPC. Lots of people don't even know what an EPC is or whether there is one for the place where they live unless they've recently moved house. The layout of EPC reports isn't very user-friendly in most countries, and the information and the recommendations contained in the Energy Performance Certificate isn't always very clear. So as an example, in Austria, the EPC recommendations are in an annex to the main report. In Sweden, recommendations are just very general, and in France, there aren't any recommendations. It's also not clear on the EPC whether savings are based on predicted or measured energy consumption, which can make a big difference. In part of our evaluation work, we found that 75% of residents responding to our questionnaires said they weren't familiar with the EPC. So it's a real issue here, and we've recommended that improvements are needed to EPCs to make sure that clear recommendations are made in the report and that reports are easier for members of the public to understand. This would add real value to the EPC. In some countries, and this is the rationale for developing the extra toolkit for the whole building approach, EPCs can't be done on a whole building where it's been split into apartments. And in some countries, it's the opposite. EPCs can't be done for individual apartments in multi-occupancy buildings. Communal areas aren't always included in the EPC, so recommendations on things like lighting and stairwell areas are patchy. And both of these things mean that carrying out whole building retrofit using EPC recommendations has real challenges. So we're calling for whole building EPCs to be made possible in all member states, with minimum standards for addressing communal areas, and to put multi-occupancy buildings on a par with regular single-occupier houses. There's also issues with the methodology used for EPC calculations, which are different in different countries and not always totally accurate. So in some EPC reports, you end up with recommendations that are not actually those which would be best for the building in real life. And in the worst cases, the recommendations aren't even possible for that building. This particular recommendation isn't specific to multi-occupancy buildings. It's non-traditional buildings, heritage buildings have always been tricky. And in some countries, including Germany, EPCs are exempt for specific properties. But it's another thing which would make them more useful in the armoury for addressing retrofit. So we're making a case for improvements to the methodology used in EPC calculations to make the information in the report more accurate, and to make the methodology used more consistent between different countries and different certification bodies, which will also help with comparability of EPCs between different member states. Another issue linked to this is that not all countries have accreditation schemes for EPC assessors. And that's not to say that assessors don't generally do a good job, they do. But we've heard examples of some very poor practice in some countries. For example, assessors putting together reports without even visiting the property. So our recommendation on this topic is to address the issue with well-designed accreditation schemes in all countries. The topic of information provision came up quite a lot in our work. Low motivation to carry out energy efficiency retrofit can be linked to an information barrier and poor understanding of improvement options and people not understanding the cost and benefits of doing work. We also know that local organisations offering impartial, reliable advice are seen as trustworthy and are genuinely able to facilitate and catalyse action. But access to good impartial advice, including advice on the availability of subsidies, is not always available. So we're recommending help to facilitate the take-up of measures by improving the provision of information on low-carbon retrofit and expanding local energy advice services and demonstration projects. Along similar lines, EPCs aren't really a big factor at the moment in people's decision-making around improvements. And this is true at the level of the individual householder as well as for building managers, and even more widely in the planning of retrofit schemes. But there is potential for EPCs and EPC data to play a much greater role here. One starting point would be to make EPC data publicly available to help inform decisions. And it is in some countries, at least to a certain extent, but not in all countries, even though it is an EPBD requirement. So we recommend that every country needs to develop and maintain a publicly available database of EPCs, and where possible look at the way data can be made best use of to support retrofit. Now, funding, of course, is always an issue because you need money for everything. But the level of financial support for energy efficiency measures varies hugely between and within different countries. We found that access to finance was a really major factor in almost every LEAF case study, including some that didn't get off the ground because residents were unwilling to make a personal contribution and because no subsidies were available. So we know from general experience and also from specific feedback within the case study buildings that subsidies do stimulate demand. But having said that, it's not necessarily the case that subsidies have to be for 100% of the cost of work. Sometimes people are prepared to make a contribution. And in France, it's becoming increasingly common to take out a loan to make up the difference between the cost of retrofit work and the available funding. Most countries do have some form of state support for energy efficiency measures, but funding is often inconsistent and piecemeal. In some cases, it actually becomes a barrier rather than a facilitator, because the stop-start nature of funding means people will wait for the next funding scheme rather than go ahead and make improvements. And then at the same time, we've also seen residents who refuse to believe that funding really is available because previously they'd been promised funding which was withdrawn. So we recommend that funding schemes are improved in terms of their design and their management. It's crucial, and I can't emphasise this enough, it's really important that public funding schemes are long-term, well-publicised and easy to access. And we also suggest that financial support initiatives, so things like reduced tax on energy efficiency products, lower charges for purchasing low-energy properties and so on, also need to be expanded so that there's more of these types of initiatives and different types of initiatives available to help stimulate take-up. Expanding on this theme a little bit, EPCs come back in again. There's potential for EPCs to be used more in developing financial support initiatives for energy efficiency improvements. The link between funding and EPCs could be made much more explicit. At the moment, it's not really, but it would help to raise awareness of energy performance and potentially help to target financing where it's most needed. EPCs have been used in funding programmes in the UK and France to a certain extent as a basis for expected energy savings from specific measures. But there's potential for much more to happen in this area, and there's more work to do in most member states for making this link. Now, you'll probably have gathered from the two previous presentations the complexities of multi-occupancy buildings and the management arrangements. So in this context, it's worth just explaining a bit more about multi-occupancy buildings and how the number of different stakeholders makes it all more complicated. There's limited resource in building maintenance funds to pay for any kind of project management role. There's often not a building maintenance fund at all. And it takes a really long time to make a decision when there's so many people involved. There are added complexities when there are laws about freehold and leasehold which need to be understood and observed. And the tenancy type also makes a difference. So buildings can be all owner-occupied, occupied just by tenants, or have a mixture of people renting and owning their property. But in all cases, having multiple occupants and often not very good communication between them means it's really difficult to reach people to present retrofit options, let alone getting them to agree on a plan to proceed. It's entirely possible, and we have seen it happen, that one single person in a building can prevent a retrofit project from going ahead, even where all the other residents were willing to consider options. And where communication is slow, there can also be problems with accessing finance. So in the French example, there's a year between the meetings of the residents, by which time subsidies may have changed. And coordinating work, so where residents move on or staff in the building management company change, it becomes very difficult just on the timeframes and the number of people involved. And to make things worse, building management companies are generally not run by people who have any technical expertise, so projects can get sidelined completely or a risk of ill-informed choices being made. In some of our work, engagement of residents and building owners wasn't possible at all because we couldn't even get hold of basic contact details for landlords, and trying to knock on people's door and send letters were just ignored. So we found that in multi-occupancy buildings, basic management arrangements need to be in place so that decisions affecting multiple stakeholders can be made, so improvements can go ahead and not be stalled by problems with communication or one party preventing progress. And that could be introduced as national policy with quite far-reaching impacts in this area. And at building level, the cost and time of employing experts to manage large retrofit projects, taking it outside the core work of the building management company, should also be considered where possible so that informed decisions can be made and retrofit projects can have the best results for the building and its occupiers. And this links into the idea of maintenance plans. So another thing that would make a really big difference to increasing the number of retrofit projects which do proceed is having a long-term building maintenance plan in place. So we also experienced issues linked to the low priority given to energy efficiency improvements compared to essential maintenance work and other demands on limited funds. A hole in the roof will always, and quite rightly, trump an insulation project in an either-or situation. But we've recommended that long-term maintenance plans with ring-fenced funding are made a requirement for multi-occupancy buildings. And this is something which is being introduced in France from next year and looks like a really intelligent policy given the problems we've encountered in Leaf. It's not just because a long-term plan would affect the way that energy efficiency improvements are paid for. It also means that decisions can be agreed in advance, saving several years of decision-making in some cases. And that ability to plan ahead also means retrofit projects can be made more cost-effective. On the supply side, the supply chain, of course, has a really vital role to play in any retrofit project, but there are barriers around getting hold of reliable installers, difficulties with coordinating different contractors, and generally not many cases where contractors themselves are flagging up opportunities for energy efficiency improvements to be made alongside more general maintenance work. There are different angles to this. Policy change could address improvements to the quality of retrofit works through accreditation schemes, by supporting local installer networks, and encouraging retrofit projects which go beyond simply achieving minimum standards. And we need to see better integration of builders and tradespeople in the supply chain, and within the supply chain we want more people trained and able to deliver high quality work and good customer service. So the sector needs improved support so that it can expand to deliver the scale of retrofit that's needed. This includes improving funding schemes, moving away from single measure funding, and expanding financial support initiatives so that builders and installers can have more leverage to promote low carbon measures to householders, including wherever possible making improvements alongside existing retrofit and maintenance work. So for example, if pipework has access to fix leaks, it should be lagged at the same time. If an external wall needs re-rendering and scaffoldings going up, the possibility of external wall insulation should be considered. So our recommendations here are around upskilling the workforce with a focus on developing local networks and improving our mission for retrofit projects, and improving that integration between maintenance work that has to happen anyway on a building and opportunities for retrofit. The final area here is around the regulatory framework. There's a really strong case to be made for legal and regulatory mechanisms to be put in place or tightened up to help stimulate retrofit in multi-occupancy buildings. We've seen that where there are regulations, they can be used to ensure work proceeds and doesn't get relegated to the bottom of the priority pile and put off year after year. Regulations to make improvements compulsory already works well in some situations, and combining low carbon improvements with other retrofit and maintenance work is also good where it's already happening. So in Germany there are minimum requirements and very high penalties for not installing measures where they're required, which is a good example of the carrot and stick approach in practice. On the other hand, we've also got regulations around historic and heritage buildings that can sometimes be too tight or can be being interpreted in a way which is unfavourable to retrofit work proceeding, even though sensitive retrofit, where you preserve the important characteristics of the building and also make it more energy efficient, is entirely possible. So we're recommending minimum requirements be introduced at the point of sale and at the point of renovation, and that guidance on retrofit and heritage properties is revised to make it more possible, but we're recommending that both of these are done sensitively. We're also aware that setting minimum requirements could be very contentious and that policies would need to be developed carefully to ensure they're appropriate in a range of situations, particularly given that many residents of multi-occupancy buildings are vulnerable and on low incomes. And if the result of renovations was higher rents and unaffordable rent level, we don't want to cause problems there. But it's worth talking through these concerns because the wins we could achieve from having stronger regulations, pushing through retrofit and multi-occupancy buildings and cutting through some of the challenges are worth going for. So I'm not going to read these all out, don't worry. That's the 18 recommendations that I've just run through. There's also, in the reports on the LEAF website, there are national reports for each of the partner countries with much more specific information about national and local policy recommendations. And I'm just going to touch very briefly on some examples of best practice from across the European countries we looked at. And there are some, and in fact wider than just the LEAF project, we identified some national strategies as well as regional schemes which could be replicated elsewhere. There's more in the report, so it's worth looking at for more detail. But just a couple of examples are, number one here, the requirement to do energy efficiency work at the same time as maintenance work is carried out. So this policy is already being introduced in France from 2017, and this would be a really great one if other countries follow suit. So it just makes a lot of sense with cost effectiveness, planning ahead. It's a really sensible policy. Then the third one mentioned on this slide here, the rental price point system. This is something from the Netherlands where rent setting is based on a home point system. So various features including energy efficiency improvements add points so that over the long term the cost of improvements can be recouped by building owners because they can charge more, and the occupiers benefit because they get lower running costs. Just picking one of the others from here, number 6, targeted funding for those most in need. So this is happening in Scotland already with the area-based programmes. And this is one that's really important for addressing fuel poverty because it's about making sure the funding reaches the places where it needs to reach. Now there's also in the report, and I won't go into this in a lot of detail because I think we're running out of time, we've made recommendations for further research. And I'm just going to sum up those overall recommendations. So this is my cartoon examples of some of low energy apartment buildings. We're really keen to see specific improvements to EPC methodology, including making it possible to have whole building EPCs in all countries and improving the way calculations are made. And also changes to the format and content of EPC reports to make them more user-friendly and more valuable. We'd like to see better information provision on low-carbon retrofit and better communication between stakeholders to help facilitate more retrofit projects. Implementation of maintenance plans and better integration of retrofit with maintenance and renovation work to make it more cost-effective. The introduction of more stringent minimum standards to force the issue. Support for the supply chain, including training schemes and better funding programs, and implementation of accreditation schemes for assessors and installers. And finally, improvements to public funding schemes and expansion of financial support initiatives, in particular ensuring that public funding is long-term, targeted and easy to access. So to sum up, there's more information in the reports on the LEAF website. Do have a look at the website and the reports. We'd really love you to go away after this thinking and talking more about multi-occupancy buildings, the particular niche they occupy and the potential they have for big carbon savings. Sadly, it's not possible to snap our fingers and just make all our apartment blocks magically warmer, cheaper to run, less energy consuming. But we can change and shape policy to make it easier to carry out retrofit. So the final thing to ask is that you will consider which policy recommendations you might be able to influence or implement to help address some of the challenges with retrofitting apartment buildings. So that's all from me. I think I'm handing back now to Tessa for more questions.